Welcome, everybody, to this special News of the Day edition of Star Cells and God. Star Cells and God is the podcast where we explore how the discoveries happening at the frontiers of science provide evidence for God's existence, the reliability of Scripture, and the credibility of the Christian worldview. My name is Rana. I'm a biochemist and a Christian apologist, and I work for an organization called Reasons to Believe. This is the organization that sponsors this podcast thanks to the generous donations of viewers and listeners like you. If you want to know more about Reasons to Believe, go to our website, www.reasons.org. Also, you can follow us on social media, RTB_official. And then finally, don't forget to go to our YouTube channel where we have all kinds of great video content that is designed to address a wide range of science faith issues. And while you're there, subscribe, use the notification button too, so that you can be alerted when the next episode of Star Cells and God drops. Okay, without any further ado, let's get into this headline garnering discovery. Late last week, that would be the last week of June 2024, there was a team from Spain that published an article in a journal called Science Advances. And this is a journal that's part of the Nature family of journals. And I've got a slide showing the title and the abstract of that article. And it's, again, work by a team of researchers from Spain, a large team of collaborators who reported on a characterization of a Neanderthal fossil. This would have been a partial skull fossil that corresponded to the temporal region of the skull. And based on a detailed analysis of this fossil specimen, they concluded that this must have been a child that died at 6 years of age. And by using CT technology, they were able to determine that based on the inner ear structure, this child most likely had Down syndrome. Now, this is a significant discovery in and of itself because it gives us an understanding about the natural history of Down syndrome. And it tells us that Neanderthals suffered from Down syndrome, so that in and of itself is enough to garner headlines. But in addition to that, the research team concluded that this must mean that Neanderthals were engaged in compassionate care for members of their group. And in fact, this is what really inspired headlines in Science in the News articles all over the world. Just as a couple of examples, I've got a slide showing two of these headlines. One comes from The Guardian that focuses on the compassion that Neanderthals must have delivered to members of their group. The other headline is from The New Scientist that shows that Neanderthals, again, must have had Down syndrome. So again, both headlines illustrate the type of focus that the science news outlets had on this particular discovery. Now, this is a scientifically significant find because it gives us some better understanding about Neanderthals. And everybody loves Neanderthals. Everybody's fascinated by these hominins. But not only does it give us an understanding about Neanderthals, but by learning about Neanderthals, we also learn about ourselves as human beings. And particularly the question, are we unique as human beings? Are we exceptional? Or were Neanderthals just like us, as the implication of this particular discovery seems to imply? That if Neanderthals were engaged in compassionate care of members of their group, that's the same thing we do as modern humans. Maybe we truly aren't exceptional after all. Now, as a Christian, I'm also very much interested in what this discovery means for the biblical claim that human beings bear God's image. As human beings, according to Scripture, we uniquely bear God's image, that we are unique and exceptional compared to all other creatures. And at Reasons to Believe, we take the view that Adam and Eve were created as real human beings, the first humans that God made. They were the sole progenitors of all humanity. All humanity descends from them, and that they were made in God's image. And we argue that Adam and Eve must have been anatomically and behaviorally modern humans, because we are descendants of Adam and we are anatomically and behaviorally modern humans. And we would argue that Neanderthals were creatures that God created that existed for a period of time and went extinct, that they were remarkable creatures in their own right, that they had intelligence and some type of emotional capacity, but they lacked the image of God. And as a result, we would predict that while they may be biologically similar to modern humans, they would be behaviorally different and would be cognitively inferior, missing or having an absence of the image of God. So then, how do we make sense of this discovery? Well, we'll get to that in a minute, but let's first of all unpack the discovery itself, because in my view, this is work that represents science at its very best. Now, the particular fossil that these researchers studied was recovered from a site called Cova Negra in Spain. And so this is a map showing Europe, and you can see that I circled in red where Cova Negra is located. It's a coastal area of Spain, and there is an archaeological site there that has been excavated since the 1920s. This particular site has multiple layers, and those layers date between 276,000 and about 146,000 years in age. So any hominin fossil that is recovered from this site is most certainly going to be Neanderthal remains. Now, in 1989, there was an excavation of this site, and the particular fossil that was studied by the Spanish researchers was excavated, was labeled, and then put into storage, and had remained there for a number of years. And recently, this specimen caught the eye of the Spanish researchers, because they recognized that this was part of the skull, and it was the temporal region of the skull, which is where the inner ear is located. The temporal skull protects the inner ear, and so they reasoned that maybe they could actually access the anatomical features of Neanderthal's inner ear from this fossil specimen using CT technology, where they can do CT scans and recreate three-dimensional images of not only the fossil, but gain insight into the interior of the fossil with this technique. And so this is a image from the journal article of the fossil on the top, and then the three-dimensional reconstruction of the fossil with the CT technology. Rather impressive. Now, even though they were quite certain that this specimen was a Neanderthal skull fragment, they wanted to be certain, and so they did a three-dimensional characterization of the different features of this fossil specimen. Particularly, again, this is focusing on the temporal region of the skull, and then did a detailed comparison with Neanderthal skulls and with modern human skulls using a multivariate statistical analysis, and they showed unequivocally that this was in fact a Neanderthal skull. But in addition to that, they also showed that the estimate at the time of death for this specimen would have been about 6 years in age, maybe no more than 6 years. Now, you can't tell if this was a male or female individual, but they nicknamed the particular fossil specimen Tina, giving it a girl's nickname. But again, nobody really knows what the sex of this particular individual was. They then did a reconstruction of the inner ear, and this is the CT images of the inner ear that they were able to generate, which again is absolutely remarkable from a scientific standpoint. And then they were able to characterize the inner ear, and they noted that it looked like this individual suffered from some kind of pathology that would have limited the individual's capacity to hear. They either were entirely deaf or had very poor hearing. Also, it looked as if this individual would have suffered from extreme vertigo, dizziness, and would struggle with their balance. And this is based on recognizing that one of the semicircular canals is much larger than you would expect, and the other one is fused with the vestibular aqueduct. And normally that fusion doesn't take place. Those are distinct, and the cochlea is actually reduced. And so they surveyed a number of human genetic disorders that lead to loss of hearing and have characteristic inner ear pathologies, and they concluded it's most likely that this individual actually suffered from Down syndrome. So what they concluded from their study was, again, this was a fossil specimen from a Neanderthal individual that was 6 years of age at the time of death that suffered from Down syndrome. This is a sound scientific inference from the data. What follows now is, in my mind, speculation that isn't necessarily unreasonable, but it is highly speculative. And that is, they argue that there is no way that this individual could have survived apart from ongoing care from members of the group. And that because this individual had no way of really truly benefiting the group, this must have been altruistic behavior that was motivated by empathy and compassion. Now, one of the big questions with regard to Neanderthals was were they engaged in care for members of their community, and what was the nature of that care? And we know that there are a number of Neanderthal finds that show that Neanderthals suffered injury, and that injury would have been devastating to the individual, and that they survived for a number of years after the injury. There's also a number of Neanderthal remains that show disease, pathologies, and that these diseases would again been disabling, and those individuals survived for a number of years with that disease. And so this indicates that Neanderthals took care of members of their own group. But it's not clear whether this was reciprocal altruism or altruism motivated by compassion and empathy. There's a lot of animals that engage in altruistic behavior, but it's more reciprocal behavior. I scratch your back, maybe one day you'll scratch my back in the future, right? So that there's a benefit to the individual to being kind and supportive for other members of the group because of that reciprocal nature of the kindness, of the altruism. But the argument is that if this is a 6-year-old child that has Down syndrome, that suffers from hearing loss and suffers with balance issues, there's no way that this individual is going to benefit the group. Therefore, the argument is this must have been an example of compassionate altruism. And the argument is that this is exactly what modern humans do. We are unique in displaying this type of altruistic behavior, but now the argument goes, if Neanderthals engaged in this behavior, then Neanderthals were much more like us, and maybe we really aren't unique and exceptional as human beings. Now, this is again a highly speculative scenario that is not unreasonable, but it is highly speculative. There's alternate scenarios that you could imagine. For example, the Neanderthal's mother may have had such strong maternal instincts that she would have done everything that she could to care for her child that suffered from Down syndrome. And it could very well be that the group actually shunned this child, didn't offer any kind of support to the mother or the child, but that the mother was able to do this because she had the help of the child's with Down syndrome's siblings or other close family members who would have helped her. Or it could be that the group helped her, even though that child really was of no quote-unquote value to the group, because they would anticipate in the future that child's mother would engage in reciprocal behavior, right? So there are alternate explanations for how this child could actually survive. Also, we're making the assumption that the child with Down syndrome would have nothing to contribute to the Neanderthal group. And we know from our experiences with interacting with people with Down syndrome is they can be highly gregarious, quite outgoing, lovely individuals who can create a type of social cohesion around them. Sarah Turner, who wasn't one of the researchers but commented on the work in a New Scientist article said this: people with Down syndrome contribute in all sorts of ways to modern human societies. And I'm sure that this was true in Neanderthal society too. So in other words, you can't conclude that this wasn't reciprocal altruistic behavior. Also, she points out that, again, we don't really know anything about this individual other than it died at 6 years of age and suffered from Down syndrome. She goes on to say there's a lot of variation in terms of what is considered a disability and how people with disabilities are treated in different human contexts. Compassion is one possible motivator, but without knowing about someone's life and how they were treated and behaved, I don't think we can say too much about how and why they survived. In other words, anything that we really try to conclude about Neanderthal culture and Neanderthal motivation from this fossil specimen is ultimately sheer speculation. Now, let's just say for the sake of argument that we grant that Neanderthals were motivated for compassion to care for this individual, that the group rallied around this mother and helped her care for this individual. Does that mean that the Neanderthals were like us as modern humans? Maybe, maybe not. It's interesting because there's a couple of studies that are worth note. One of them was done in 2015 by a team of Japanese researchers. This work was published in a journal called Primates, and they were studying a group of chimpanzees in Tanzania. And they noted that in this group, there was a mother that gave birth to an infant that looked like it suffered from Down syndrome or something akin to Down syndrome. This infant lived for 2 years because the mother, due to her intense maternal instincts, cared for this infant, was very protective of the infant, and had the help of the infant's siblings to ensure that this child could survive for 2 years. And the members of the group were ambivalent to the child. They didn't shun it, but they didn't show it any kind of extra care or attention. And so this was, again, an example where you see an infant in a non-human primate being cared for by the mother and family members. And again, could this be the case for the Neanderthal infant? Also, there was another study published as a review article where one of the authors was Sarah Turner, and she and her team surveyed a large number of studies looking at disabilities that have been recorded for non-human primates in captivity, free-ranging non-human primates, as well as non-human primates in the wild, and identified a large number of instances where members of the group suffered from disabilities. And those members were able to survive in part because of behavioral flexibility, but also in part because of the care of the community. So in other words, what we see with Neanderthals isn't necessarily unique compared to other primates. And so in light of that, what Neanderthals are doing is really akin to what we see other primates do. And it's not really clear if indeed this was truly a non-reciprocal altruistic behavior. And it is true that only modern humans are known to engage in altruistic behavior motivated by compassion and empathy. But not only do we show altruism for members of our own group, but we also show altruism for people who are not part of our group, who are not part of our quote-unquote tribe. And this seems to be unique among modern humans. One final point, and then I'll bring everything to a close, and that's this, that when we interpret Neanderthal behavior from the fossil record or the archaeological record, we need to be very cautious about making sure that our interpretations really fit with the totality of the evidence. Because yes, indeed, there are studies that claim Neanderthals engaged in music, in art, in jewelry production, that they had language, they mastered fire, and the list goes on and on. But every one of these claims is actually disputed by other studies that challenge those interpretations. So the best we can say is that we really don't know whether or not Neanderthals engaged in advanced sophisticated behavior. I tend to think that they didn't, because when we look at the trajectory of the fossil record and the archaeological record for Neanderthals, we see that their technology remains static. And Neanderthals were on Earth longer than we have been on Earth as modern humans. Yet with modern humans, we see a very different trajectory. Our technology emerges as being primitive, though even in its primitive state, it was more sophisticated than what we see with Neanderthals. And our technology evolved very rapidly from the point of being primitive to being able to put human beings on the moon. There has to be something different between humans and Neanderthals to explain the difference in trajectory of our technology. And I would argue that that difference, from a Christian perspective, correlates with the image of God. Also, we know from anatomical studies that modern humans and Neanderthals had very different brain structures. Even though Neanderthals had a brain that was as large, maybe even larger than ours, their brain structure was different, and that difference in brain structure would imply that modern humans had superior cognitive abilities to Neanderthals, that we would be unique and that we would be exceptional. And in fact, when we look at this temporal lobe bone of Neanderthals, it's very clear that it is Neanderthal in nature, not modern human in nature, again reinforcing the idea that there are differences in our craniofacial anatomy that has implications for our brain structure. And then finally, we have access to the Neanderthal genome, and there are a number of genes that are different in the human genome and the Neanderthal genome. Those genes are involved in neural development and in cognition, and these differences again imply cognitive differences between humans and Neanderthals. So at the end of the day, this study, as well as the full body of evidence, really does indeed affirm the idea that humans are unique and exceptional. It doesn't mean that Neanderthals weren't remarkable creatures in their own right. In fact, they were. But they were just simply not like us. And it's reasonable to think of them as creatures that were made by God that lacked the image of God, that we could think of them in the same vein as we think of the great apes, orangutans, gorillas, and chimpanzees. So the bottom line is that this study is fascinating. It's science at its very best, but it doesn't undermine the notion of human uniqueness and exceptionalism, nor does it undermine the idea that human beings bear God's image. Okay, so I'm going to bring everything to a close now. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. I remind you to check out our website, reasons.org. Follow us on social media, RTB_official. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, Reasons to Believe. And then finally, we're interested in your thoughts. So use the comment section below the video to let us know what you think about this discovery and our analysis of the discovery. And I just want to leave you with this final thought. Until next time, the more we know about science, the more we have reasons to believe. God bless you.